The email arrived like a slammed door in a quiet corridor. 11 words that didn't even bother to dress themselves up as an argument, dispatched from one of the world's most powerful men to a woman whose whole adult life had been conducted in the public square. Jerry Hall had survived violent childhood weather, the predatory physics of fashion, the rolling thunder of rock stardom, and the peculiar cruelty of being loved by men who seemed to require an audience for every private act. Yet this, an ending delivered by screen glow while she waited at their estate, had the chilly neatness of a corporate memo. The story of how she got there begins much earlier, in Texas, with a girl who learned quickly that beauty could be both an escape route and a trap. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Jerry Fay Hall was born on July 2, 1956, in Gonzales, Texas, one of 5 daughters, including a twin sister, Terry. In the version of America that produced her, working-class suburbs, hot horizons, family was supposed to be the one dependable institution. But Hall's early life carried a rather harsher curriculum. She would later describe a father whose war trauma and volatility turned domestic space into a place you navigated like a minefield. A house where love was not a guarantee, but a variable. By her mid-teens, Hall already had the one quality that fashion scouts and photographers tend to call presence, because they don't have better language for it. Height, bone structure, and a kind of fearless visibility. But she also had something else, an impatience with the idea that her life would be confined to the perimeter of what she'd been born into. At 16, after a car accident and an insurance payout that left her with about $800, she had done something both reckless and utterly logical. She had bought a one-way ticket to Paris. She had packed a suitcase filled with her mother's hand-sewn knockoffs of Fredericks of Hollywood outfits, an almost perfect symbol of who she was at that point, a Texas girl carrying both aspiration and improvised glamour across the Atlantic. The fantasy was simple, almost naive in its candor. I had this fantasy that I would become a model, and I did, she would say later. Paris in the 1970s could still feel like a laboratory where a person might be remade. For a teenager arriving with limited money and maximal nerve, it was also a city of practical humiliations. Small rooms, uncertain meals, the strange loneliness of hearing your own language as an accent. Hall's early break reads like a modern myth. She is sunbathing on a beach in Saint-Tropez, and an agent discovers her. Myth, however, tends to be the public face of a more ordinary truth. A young woman placing herself where she might be seen again and again until the world looks back. Either way, the result was rapid acceleration. She moved in creative circles, sharing an apartment, according to later accounts, with fellow aspiring models who would become famous in other registers, including Grace Jones and Jessica Lange. It's the sort of detail that sounds like retroactive legend because it contains so much compressed destiny. A handful of young women, not yet fully mythologized, learning how to be watched by millions. Hall's breakthrough did not come solely from runway work or editorial spreads, but from an image that fused fashion and music. Exactly the kind of cross-pollination that the decade loved. In 1975, she posed as the blue-painted mermaid on the cover of Roxy Music's Siren, invited into that moment by Brian Ferry. The cover didn't just introduce her, it placed her inside a visual language of glamour and artifice, the kind of beauty that looks designed rather than inherited from a gene pool. The mermaid is all invitation and distance, a dangerous creature meant to be desired, not approached. Hall, who understood performance instinctively, would spend much of her public life navigating that same tension, being accessible enough to fascinate, remote enough to survive. Ferry, in the way of charismatic men who are used to being the axis, fell hard. Hall would later describe their first encounter in romantic shorthand, love at first sight, and their relationship quickly became part of the story the public could tell about her. It's a familiar cultural move. When a beautiful woman rises, the world looks for a man to attach her to, as if her orbit must be explained by someone else's gravity. But if Ferry provided entry into a certain kind of art world electricity, Hall's own labour was what made her into a professional phenomenon. By the late 1970s, she was among the most in-demand models on the planet. By 1977, she had reportedly appeared on around 40 magazine covers and was commanding fees that crossed the psychological threshold, over $1,000 a day, where a young woman stops being lucky and starts being perceived as a commercial force and an economy of one. She worked with major photographers, studied posing and classic art, and became associated with major campaigns, including Yves Saint Laurent's Opium and Revlon. In that era, modelling was both less sanitized and more aristocratic than it would become. The job involved long days, intense control of the body, and a social scene that offered pleasure with one hand and consequences with the other. Hall, who could easily have been swallowed by the era's appetites, presented herself as oddly disciplined. She joked that she never saw the point of drugs when, quote, a couple of glasses of red wine with friends was just as much fun. It reads like a throwaway line, but it suggests a particular temperament. She liked sensation, not oblivion. She wanted to be present for her own life. Her personal life, however, was heading toward the kind of public entanglement that makes this so-called presence feel like exposure. In the late 1970s, while she was still linked to Ferry, Hall caught the attention of Mick Jagger. This attention turned into a secret affair, conducted with a kind of comic stealth, Jagger covering his famous face to avoid detection, and Hall later admitted with a bluntness that feels more Texan than tabloid that she loved them both. People say it's impossible to love two people, but I did, she said. Nonetheless, in 1979 she left Ferry for Jagger, who was older, already mythologized and in the process of disentangling from his marriage to Bianca. To understand what Jerry Hall became in the 1980s, it helps to understand what it meant to become Mick Jagger's partner at that time. This wasn't merely a romance, it was an annexation into a global franchise of desire, fame, and permanent scrutiny. Hall and Jagger became one of the decade's signature couples, photographed at parties, premieres, tours, and in the liminal spaces between them, those moments when the flashbulbs catch you mid-step and turn the body into headline material. Yet the arrangement also involved a quieter, more intimate gamble. Hall began to step away from full-time modelling in order to build a domestic life. Motherhood arrived in a sequence that mapped the calendar of her life for the next decade and more. The couple had 4 children: Elizabeth, born 1984, James, born 1985, Georgia May, born 1992, and Gabriel, born 1997. To have children with a man like Jagger is to attempt something both ordinary and faintly surreal. Packing school lunches while the person you're living with is also a symbol and a wild horse. Hall reportedly insisted early on that Jagger quit hard drugs, and she tried to impose a kind of pragmatic order, family routines, meals, the tactile realities that make celebrity feel briefly irrelevant. The details, suburban Richmond, cooking, chickens in the yard, read like a deliberate refusal of rock star unreality. It's a portrait of a woman trying to build an island of normalcy inside a storm system. In November 1990, after more than a decade together, Hall and Jagger staged a lavish Hindu wedding ceremony in Bali. It looked to the public like consummation, the bad boy prince apparently settling down. But the ceremony's later fate would become one of the sharpest examples of how women can be asked to live inside men's fictions, and then be told the fiction never counted. When the relationship collapsed at the end of the decade, Jagger's lawyers argued that the Bali ceremony was not legally valid under Indonesian or English law, and the High Court ultimately declared the marriage null and void from the beginning. This was a low blow. Jerry, who had lived it as a marriage in every way that mattered, time, children, public identity, later described the annulment as, quote, a bit rude, the kind of Texan understatement that conceals a blade or a six-shooter. The reason the relationship ended has been told in many registers: tabloid melodrama, gossip, moral lesson. But in Hall's own account, it comes down to exhaustion and the cumulative abrasion of betrayal. Rumours of Jagger's infidelity ran throughout the 1990s, and the breaking point arrived in 1999 when Brazilian model Luciana Morad said Jagger had fathered her child. Hall filed for divorce. The court responded by annulling a marriage it said had never existed. It's one thing to be left, it's another to have a shared life legally described as a misunderstanding. And yet, even in the wreckage, Hall's public voice did not collapse into victimhood. She admitted she was, quote, depressed and worn out, and she also allowed herself a brutal, almost comedic clarity about what she had wanted. A large family, a full domestic chapter. After the fourth child, she joked that she thought, quote, right, he's served his purpose. It's a line that scandalizes because it reverses the usual gender script. She is the one describing a famous man as instrument rather than destiny. That reversal is part of what has always made Hall difficult to sentimentalize. She could be romantic, but she was also practical. Even her sadness had a spine. The settlement that followed was reportedly enormous, and the co-parenting arrangement oddly intimate. Hall remained in the Richmond Hill house, while Jagger moved nearby to stay close to the children. Hall later emphasized that they maintained a friendly relationship for the sake of their family, noting that people found it confusing that they got on well, but that they would not give up on being friends and parents. This is not the standard narrative of the wrong woman cutting ties. It is instead the story of a woman who decided that rage would not be her only inheritance. While the world often treated her as a glamorous appendage, a muse, a girlfriend, an emblem, Hall was quietly building a second professional identity. Acting had been in the periphery of her life for years. A film role in Urban Cowboy in 1980, and then the high-profile part of Alicia Hunt in Tim Burton's Batman in 1989. She also moved onto the stage, taking on the Marilyn-adjacent role of Cherie in Bus Stop, and later performing in London's West End. Acting offered something modelling rarely does, the chance to be seen as more than surface. It also offered risk, live performance, the possibility of failure in real time. After the Jagger split, that risk became part of her reinvention. In 2000, she played Mrs. Robinson in a London stage production of The Graduate, a role that arrived preloaded with cultural freight, older female desire, male anxiety, the spectacle of transgression. The production generated sensational headlines, including attention to an on-stage striptease, proof that the public still wanted Hall's body to be the story even when she was doing an actor's work. But Hall, who had never been shy about speaking plainly, seemed to enjoy puncturing the sanctimony around it. Theatre, she quipped, was better than sex. You can do it 8 times a week and still you don't get pregnant. It's a joke, yes, but it also reveals something about her. A refusal to be embarrassed by appetite and an almost athletic view of performance. In the 2000s, she continued to accumulate eclectic credits. The Vagina Monologues, Calendar Girls, television appearances, and a brief stint on Strictly Come Dancing in 2012. She also set a Guinness World Record in 2004 by appearing in 6 West End shows in a single night, a theatrical marathon that reads as both charity stunt and private statement. I'm still here. I can still do the work. I'm not only a relic of someone else's youth. Even her ventures into reality television, like the VH1 dating show Kept, carried an undertone of control. If the culture wanted to treat her as a glamorous proposition, she would at least be the one holding the contract. The person that emerges from these years is more complex than the tabloid caricature. Hall was often described by friends and interviewers as intellectually curious. She called herself a science lover, and that her IQ was reported as unusually high. She collected serious contemporary art, Warhol, Basquiat, and later sold part of the collection, citing worries about keeping valuable works at home. She published a glossy autobiography cum photo book in 2010 and joked that an earlier memoir draft had been rejected as too dull without more Jagger gossip, a remark that reveals a particular kind of fame trap. The world is rarely interested in a woman's life, unless it can be framed as access to an interesting man. Hall's response was not outrage, but wry acceptance, then continued onward motion. Romantically, the post-Jagger years were marked by a freedom that the press alternately eroticized and scolded. Hall dated, was linked to various men, and spoke candidly about pleasure and practicality. She joked about younger men having stamina, while adding, with a conspiratorial emphasis on experience, that older men were better lovers. She also made it clear she wasn't desperate to remarry. She had her own money, she didn't want to be bossed around. The subtext is unmistakable. She had already lived one version of the fairy tale, and it came with enough fine print to make her read contracts closely. Then in 2015, the late life twist that even seasoned gossip editors might have dismissed as implausible: Jerry Hall and Rupert Murdoch. They reportedly met in Australia and began a relationship that moved quickly. In January 2016, their engagement was announced in the marriages section of Murdoch's own newspaper, The Times, a gesture so perfectly on brand it felt like satire, written by someone with an unusually high budget. On March 4th, 2016, they married in London, civilly first, followed by a church service at St Bride's on Fleet Street. For Hall, it was her first legally recognised marriage, a fact that carries a quiet sting when you remember the barley annulment. What did this marriage mean? To the public, it looked like the ultimate merger. A Texan supermodel turned London fixture joining one of the most influential press dynasties on earth. To Hall, friends suggested, it may have, if we're being generous, felt like a different kind of partnership, less fueled by hedonism and chaos, more rooted in companionship and perhaps a belated promise of stability. Hall cared for Murdoch during serious health challenges, including a fall that injured him. If Hall's life with Jagger had been a long negotiation with appetite and betrayal, her life with Murdoch, at least externally, read as a quieter role. She was the devoted wife in a late chapter, but her husband just happened to be the living caricature of corporate media evil, and that is why the ending landed with such frost. In June 2022, Murdoch abruptly ended the marriage by email. Hall was, by reports, waiting to meet him at their UK estate when the message arrived. Jerry, sadly I've decided to call an end to our marriage. We have certainly had some good times, but I have much to do. Then the managerial coda, his New York lawyer, would contact hers. Friends described her as utterly blindsided, humiliated and devastated. Words that feel almost too emotional for a story conducted over a single paragraph of email text. The divorce was finalized in August 2022. Then, things turned surreal. There was, reportedly, a clause barring Hall from feeding story ideas to the writers of HBO's fantastic media satire Succession, as if her imagination itself had become a legal risk. And then there was the darker anecdote, one circulating via press reports, that Jerry, a recent convert to Catholicism, decided to burn an effigy of Murdoch on Ash Wednesday. If true, it was a private ritual of anger staged like folk theatre. And if other personifications are true, then Satan would have understood the terms of the deal clearly, although Rupert perhaps already has a suite down there anyway. One can read these details as tabloid embroidery, but they also align with something consistent in Jerry. She has always treated life as performance without necessarily treating it as a joke. When she's hurt, she expresses it. When she is angry, she does not pretend to be above it. Despite her newfound religious faith, she is not a saint, and she has never tried to market herself as one. By the mid-2000s, Hall's public life had shifted into a different register, less constant visibility, more selective appearances, and emphasis on family. She has split time between London and Texas, remaining close to her children, two of whom, Elizabeth and Georgia May, followed her into modelling, an inheritance that is both obvious and faintly ominous, if you remember what the industry can do. Hall's story has always involved motherhood, not as an accessory, but as a structural force. The reason she tried to domesticate Jagger, the reason she sustained a friendship after betrayal, the emotional core that made even her glamorous life feel tethered to something real. If her life feels like it has already contained 3 or 4 complete arcs, Texas trauma, Paris ascent, rock consort motherhood, theatrical reinvention, billionaire marriage and email divorce, that may be because she has lived in chapters. each with its own tone and costume, each demanding a new version of the self. The story is of course ongoing, and she is as luminous as ever as she now enters her 70th year. What can be said, briefly, about her cultural legacy is this. Jerry Hall became one of the defining faces of a period when fashion, music, and celebrity fused into a single bright market. She was not merely photographed, she was used as an image to sell perfumes, albums, lifestyles, and the idea of a certain kind of sexual confidence. But she also insisted, again and again, on being a person with agency inside the spectacle, a working model who studied her craft, a mother who built routines in the shadow of a global rock machine, an actress who chased the live wire risk of theatre, and a woman who spoke about men, money, and sex with a bluntness that refused to flatter the listener. And perhaps that is the most accurate final note for now. Hall has endured the particular violence of being desired at scale, desired as an icon, desired as an accessory, desired as a story, without surrendering the right to narrate herself. Even when the men in her life tried to turn commitment into technicality, she kept moving, kept talking, kept making her own life legible on her own terms. In the end, for a woman the culture long treated as a symbol, that insistence on personhood may be the most subversive thing she ever did. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this look at the very glamorous and brilliantly smart Jerry Hall. Let me know if you have any recollections of her down in the comments. I've been Chester, thanks for tuning into Society Mysteries, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!